Everyone, thank you so much for coming. It really means the world to me that some of you have traveled from so far, from out of state, from out of country, and I'm just so pleased to be here and to give my dissertation speech in the place where I've done so much of my research, and to be able to share some of what I've done over the past 9 years, if you can believe that, with all of you today. I promise not to bore you, and with that in mind, keep a sharp ear out because I do have a quiz at the end, and whoever gets it right will get a sticker. One of them is of one of the main magazines that I use that was published in Harbin, a place that you'll hear about in a moment. And then two are the word musicology written in Japanese, which is where I'm headed after I graduate tomorrow. So thank you again for being here, and yeah, we'll jump right in. So today I'm going to talk about music and politics in Russian Manchuria, and my speech today is going to proceed in 4 parts. And so I thought, for some of you, you know about Manchuria, you've maybe grown up there or been there before, but maybe for some of you, you haven't. And so I thought we would start with the sort of historical overview of what does Manchuria mean to the former Russian Empire and the Russian aristocracy, and why is it known as the Russian Atlantis. When we think about Russian history, you can imagine, right, here's St. Petersburg and there's Moscow. It's really a movement eastward, right, through most of Russian history. For those of you who grew up in the United States, you can imagine Manifest Destiny, right, the push to keep going westward, westward. In Russia, it's the push to go eastward, eastward, right? And so eventually they hit the Pacific Ocean here. And this all begins when the Tsarevich, Nikolai II, goes to the Far East on tour, right? So he's not quite Tsar yet, but he's already thinking about his legacy, right? He knows about his predecessors and everything that they've done, the lands that they've conquered, and he wants to make the Far East his legacy. So he goes in 1890. He's both in Vladivostok, and they start building the Trans-Siberian Railway. He's also in Japan, and there's a failed assassination attempt. This is sort of foreshadowing the conflict that will happen in just a few years. Well, he gets coronated in 1896, and you can imagine this would be like the coolest Netflix movie. I don't know why they haven't made it yet. At his coronation, there's some secret deals that go on behind the scenes. So Chinese Grand Secretary Li Hongzhang comes, and Prince Lobanov, they go into a room, and Li Hongzhang signs an agreement letting the Russians build a railway through the middle of Manchuria. They could have built it all the way around, but it was going to be much longer. The road is much more treacherous. And so what are they going to get in return? Well, the Chinese Empire had just lost a huge war to Japan, the First Sino-Japanese War. So they said, sure, we'll let you build the railway, but you have to promise to defend us, right? If the Japanese attack, you know, you'll be there for us. And so they do that. And so the history of Russian Manchuria begins. So you can see here, this is the border, right, with northern China, the Qing dynasty at the time. Here's Korea, and there's Japan, sort of blocked by the insets. And they could have built, right, the railway, the Trans-Siberian, all the way around here, but as you can see from the topology, it would have been much more difficult. And so instead, they decided to just cut straight through the middle of Manchuria. And the people overseeing this planned 2 major points. So here's Harbin, right in the center. And the other major place that I've been researching is Port Arthur. So there's 2 lines. There's this main line of the Chinese Eastern Railway, and then the southern spur line going all the way down to Port Arthur. The 2 people that were in charge of this were Count Sergei Witte here, and Prince Ukhtomsky, who actually went with the Tsar to the Far East on that first tour. And so here's the first term, the major term that you should know from my dissertation, and that is railway imperialism. Okay? And this idea is that imperialism follows the construction of the railway. That is actually how they expanded into Manchuria. And Sergei Witte has a really famous quote. He says, "The railroad is like a leaven, which creates a cultural fermentation among the population. Even if it passed through an absolutely wild people along its way, it would raise them in a short time to the level prerequisite for its operation. And so I'll show you in just a second how exactly this all worked. But I'd like to describe first this notion of Russian Atlantis. So why is it Atlantis? Well, if you look at the timeline of Russian occupation and imperialism in Manchuria, it is really just conflict after conflict. Every 5 to 10 years, there's another major political upheaval. And so what happens is that when Harbin is founded in 1898, the population is just under 500, and it swells quite quickly. And so it peaks right around the time of the Sino-Soviet War, about 220,000. And it's difficult to actually pin down an exact number because, as I'll talk about, there were emigres and Soviets and peoples who were former, Russian subjects, but maybe took on Chinese citizenship or took on a different citizenship. And starting with the Japanese invasion in 1931, the population rapidly declines. And notably in 1945, when the Red Army comes in and liberates the region, 20,000 people are deported back to the Soviet Union. And there's really not a population of Russians in Manchuria anymore. So it really is sort of an Atlantis in that sense. So my dissertation focuses on this period, starting with the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and then ending with the Sino-Soviet War. So how did this railway imperialism work? So they actually had a zone of extraterritoriality, which is the next term that you should know. You can imagine extraterritoriality like a consulate, right? So it's a space within a country that belongs to a different government. So the rules of that country don't actually apply to the people in a consulate. And similarly, right along the railway, so 220 feet on either side of the tracks, and then branching out around the cities, the Russians had extraterritoriality. You can also think about Hong Kong, for instance, or the international concessions in Shanghai, right? So the Russians were primarily in control. This brings us to one of the big terms in my dissertation, which is imperial imagination, right? This is not quite a colony, but it sort of is. It's a zone of extraterritoriality where Russians are in control, but it's not recognized as part of the empire, and so it has to be imagined, right? It's an imagined space within the Russian Empire. And so imperial imagination is how the geographical and cultural limits of the Russian Empire were understood and codified, or how Manchuria became territorialized as Russian. And where I come in as an ethnomusicologist is to say, well, it's not just the railway, right? It's not just soldiers who came in. It was also represented in music. And not just represented in music, actually there were people and traders and all sorts of things flowing into places like Harbin, including musical recordings and sheet music and pianos and everything else. And all of this is encompassed by this term musical circulation. So how Manchuria became Russian, in part through the circulation of music. That is the main argument of my dissertation. Okay, and that brings me right to my work. So my dissertation is 4 chapters. It's called Sounding Russian Manchuria, Musical Circulation and Imperial Imagination. And the first chapter that I have is called The Muriensky to Manchuria, Mobilizing Russian Celebrity in the Russo-Japanese War. It is the evening of February 8th, going into February 9th. We're in the Muriensky Theater, and you have Leonid Solvinov here, this tenor, singing on stage in front of the Tsar, and it's a giant benefit concert. So it earns 10 times as much money as any other concert of the entire season. So you can imagine, right, the Tsar sitting listening to this. Little does he know, on the other side of the country, the Japanese Navy have torpedoed all of its battleships, right? no prior warning. He's sitting there in the theater watching this show and has no idea that his entire fleet is sinking. Right? And so when he does find out, actually, they decide to send, there's universal conscription at the time in Russia, so they decide to send several musicians, including Sobinov, who was on stage in front of him that evening. And you can see a political cartoon here with him in his Cossack hat and a photograph of him as well. But why would they send, right, someone who's so talented, who's this emerging celebrity to the front lines? Well, what could be a better way to show that this is our land, to show that this is our territory, than by sending, right, someone from the very top of the elite theaters, someone like Sobinov? Well, not everyone agreed, right? And so you have this giant debate that emerges in the literature. Even the most outstanding talent is, first of all, a citizen. The tenor is too weak to fight with weapons in his hands, but he will probably find enough strength in himself to give a few concerts to raise funds for the Red Cross to alleviate the plight of the wounded. Another, the point is not so much about patriotism as it is about fairness. In his own eyes, every man is himself a Sobinov. And truth be told, there's no metric that could accurately distinguish the truly talented from the untalented. So what happens with the singer is, we don't know if it was true or not, but he has a nervous breakdown. He ends up getting a deferment. And the press completely has a field day with this, right? They're like, oh, he must be sent off here, or he's doing this or that. And it's only by looking at his letters that you find that he just sat in an office and filed some paperwork for about a month, and they let him off. So that's men, right? Universal conscription. Also women, right, were interested in going out to the front lines. In particular, Anastasia Vyaltseva went of her own accord. She's one of the most independently wealthy women of the entire late imperial period. But they didn't just let her off easy either. So, according to one popular magazine, on July 19th, Vyaltseva left for the Far East. Some newspapers, hardly appropriately, have mocked Miss Vyaltseva's intentions to become a nurse, gossiping about self-promotion, and gloating over the fact that she had been denied permission to go. One can marvel at the unceremonious ways that some gentlemen allow themselves to treat a woman just because she's an actress. How terrible. Another, Miss Vyaltseva is shocked by the horrors of war, and having arrived back in St. Petersburg, she is surprised to find that people here have the strength to have fun. We hope that under the influence of the horrors of war, Miss Vyaltseva will not detonate. You can imagine, for her, and there's a whole, scandal because she has a love affair with an officer and they're not supposed to get married and they secretly get married. And of course, that completely covers up any of the work that she's doing for the Red Cross. And I'll play just a little bit of what Vyaltseva's singing sounds like. So as you've heard already, right, both Vyaltseva and Sobinov are making gramophone records. And you have to remember, this is 1904 or early 1905. The gramophone was really only introduced into Russia in 1901. It starts to become commercially viable around 1903. So this is a very brand new technology, right? And these are some of the first recordings ever made in Russia. Well, General Kuropatkin, who is leading the Russian army at the time, he thinks the gramophone is a necessary piece of wartime technology. And this is actually a picture of the gramophone that he took with him all the way out to the Far East. And, a lot of this is covered. In all sorts of magazines, especially the French magazines, you can find music all over, and the mentions of people listening to the gramophone, both on the train and including on the ship. And they're not just sending some cheap models either, right? They're buying the most expensive tone arms and the most expensive equipment possible, because this is the Russian Empire, after all. We have to show how great we are even if a tone arm is going to be sort of moved around by the pitch and roll of a ship. And who are they listening to? Of course, Vyaltseva and Sobinov on the front lines. Both old and young, listening to the enchanting artist and the sounds of Russian songs, remembered their distant homeland, forgetting the horrors of the war they were experiencing. And so in this way, both through live performance and on the gramophone record, the space, the imagined sort of musical space between the Mariinsky Theater, right, the imperial capital, and the sort of height of Russian culture, and the trenches themselves is collapsed, right? That's when Manchuria starts to become Russian. As many of you know, Russia loses the Russo-Japanese War. It's a huge, embarrassing defeat. And it's actually the first time that an Asian power defeats a European power on the battlefield. And so the next chapter that I have is called Monumental Recordings, commemorating defeat on Imperial Russian 78s. So like I said, on that first initial attack, the covert attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy on the Russian Navy, most of the battleships sank. There were a few that managed to fire back and fight back, and there's a lot of legends that come out of the war, including about the ship Strigushi. And in particular, there's a couple of crewmen who decide to sink the ship rather than let it go into Japanese hands. And so it's this heroic story of martyrdom, right? Patriotic suicide. And right around the time of 1910, 1911, it's when you have a lot of monuments being constructed to these heroes. And the reason that they're building so many monuments is to try and reframe this defeat, right? This is the Russian Empire, after all. We can't lose face. And so it's transforming defeat into these narratives of martyrdom and heroism. And it's not just monuments, although this is what most historians have written about so far. There's actually a proliferation of gramophone records, commemorative gramophone records, also dedicated to these ships and these heroes. And I'll play just a small sample here of one of the records also dedicated to the Strigushi. There, the heroes of the great Rus, right, are very brave and wonderful, and so now we will die in the name of the Tsar. One of the things that I noticed in thinking about these monuments and recordings and the kind of similar work that they're doing on a social level is that the monuments built dedicated to the war tended to be very plain, right? The Strigushi had some emotion showing the two crewmen sinking the ship, but the vast majority are quite plain. But in comparison, right, the musical records dedicated to the very same ships and soldiers are quite expressive, right? And there's way more of them. Whereas this monument here in Vladivostok would not have been accessible to most people or even seen by most people, right? Recordings are produced in the tens of thousands. These are the things that helped people remember and worked through the trauma of the war itself. And if some of you are already thinking that I might talk about On the Hills of Manchuria, Na Sopkach Manchuri, this is exactly when this song was produced. It's by far the most famous song of the entire late Russian Imperial period, recorded over 30 times, and we're talking tens and tens of thousands being produced. It's really the first big hit of the Russian gramophone industry. And we have a couple copies here in this archive as well. So I'll just play you a bit of that famous melody. Hear from the pain in his voice, right? It really is an emotional reflection on the defeat of the war. Whereas, a monument is sort of just standing there, meant to be sort of passively consumed, probably just fading into the background of urban life. Something like a melody, right, will stick with you. When historians in particular talk about this late Russian imperial period, they often draw a line from the Russo-Japanese War all the way to the storming of the Winter Palace, right, in the start of the Russian Revolution. And there's this thought that the country is on imminent collapse, right? It's sort of teetering on the brink. But when you listen to these recordings, you find that people are actually still really invested in mourning, right? Still invested in the idea of the empire and reflecting on what happened. Which brings us right into the revolution, and I'm completely shifting gears here, musically speaking, to talk about jazz. And the next chapter is called Borderline Jazz, Dancing the Foxtrot in Revolutionary Harbin. So at the end of World War I, in 1918, the Allies are winning, but in 1917, the year prior, Lenin comes to power and they pull out of World War I. And so the Allies get together and they say, ooh, we can't let this happen because the Russians are leaving all of their equipment, and that could actually be taken by Germany, and they're starting to give concessions and things, and so we better go in and stop this Lenin guy. And so, maybe some of you know or don't know, there were actually Americans who landed on Russian soil and fought alongside the White Army. Here you can see an American flag in Vladivostok as part of the Allied intervention in Siberia, and this lasted for 2 years from 1918 to 1920. And in Manchuria in particular, they sent a group of engineers out to fix the railway. They were already having a lot of problems with transportation, and so they sent a bunch of engineers over to Manchuria. It was just sort of outside of the zone of Russia, safe from the war, and this is where they were working. And of course, if there are American soldiers showing up somewhere alongside guns and ammunition and technical know-how, they're going to bring their music with them. And so it was the Americans actually who brought jazz to Russia for the first time. And they're the ones who were teaching people how to dance and everything else. From the diary of one of these people: after a couple of weeks, I was sent to Harbin, Manchuria to investigate conditions, and was there about a month and had the time of my life. There were some 75 American members of the Russian Railway Service Corps quartered there at the time, and they had organized a first-class jazz band from amongst their number, and gave dances in the barracks twice a week. They had the Russian girls educated up to the latest American dances, and great times were enjoyed by all, including myself. So you can imagine this is kind of strange to think of revolution and war and everything else, and people dancing and having fun. Well, as soon as the Americans pull out, this is the moment when the Republic of China decides to take back Manchuria, right? They see that Admiral Kolchak has been captured. There's no, a clear lineage of where the power is shifting, and so Zhang Zuolin, who becomes warlord of the region, decides to reclaim the territory. But the dancing continues. If you look through the newspapers, you'll find a lot of really fascinating articles about nightlife and this burgeoning nightlife that's happening amidst this Russian Civil War. So just to read off a few of the headlines: the tragedy of the refugees in Harbin, unthinkable destitution, crowds flocking to escape the terrors of Bolshevism. Life in Harbin today, how the city passes the hours of darkness, cabaret entertainments. Shanghai has second place. Young and foreign town is a mixture of crudeness and elegance. And also White Slave story of Harbin, escape of 2 Russian girls from a Japanese cabaret at Dairen, and increasing danger. So it's really this crazy and sort of unlawful space that emerges under the rule of Zhang Zuolin right around 1920. Well, as we all know, the Soviets end up winning the Russian Civil War in October of 1922, and they almost immediately put a ban on jazz. And they see Harbin in this zone, this former zone of extraterritoriality, as land that's sort of theirs. They sort of have a claim to it, but it's different because this is where all of the emigres have been fleeing, right? People who did not want to be under Bolshevik rule fled to Harbin, about 100,000 of them, doubling the population of the city. This is how one Soviet magazine characterized it. Harbin, a city characterized less by serious art than the foxtrot, mind-blowing revelries, and late-night dancing. A city of Russian white guards and gold-epauletted soldiers. A city of the bourgeoisie and bureaucrats not yet touched by the revolution. Harbin is getting poorer with each passing hour. The military stripe of the long unchanged Tsarist uniforms are fading, and the worn-out and threadbare gold embroidery on the faded uniforms is falling apart. Harbin is eating itself, drinking itself away, squandering itself. This reputation for rambunctious nightlife continues on. And in 1923, the Soviet government actually bans the foxtrot, of all things, if you can imagine, calling it a new form of pornography on the front cover of one of their artistic magazines. And this is really when you start to see a difference, right? Whereas before people are moving back and forth from Manchuria to places like Vladivostok or Khabarovsk in the Far East, suddenly now, when people from Harbin are going back, they can't dance the things that they like to do. They can't listen to jazz. So just to quote this, Harbin residents who recently returned from Vladivostok speak about the city with great bitterness. That said, the main reason for their unfavorable impressions from visiting this pearl of the Far East was the complete absence of beloved Harbin American dances and the jazz orchestras in Vladivostok. There was really nothing to do for the visitors from Harbin. And so you see that there's a split, right, between the Soviet population and that in Manchuria, and that split is felt in the cabaret club, actually on the dance floor. And this also worked the opposite way, with Soviet agents coming over and trying to say, oh no, you can't actually dance this, it's prohibited. So Soviet rule in Harbin, a childish attempt to prohibit foxtrotting at International Hotel. And there's plenty of scandals that I've uncovered like this. So we see in this period a shift from imperial subject to émigré, right? People living in diaspora, but also that this diaspora is not a part of the USSR. And how that is felt is through jazz. And this is, quite early jazz. Stylistically speaking, it wouldn't necessarily sound like the jazz that we might recognize. So it's borderline jazz in that sense. But it's also actually a borderline between Manchuria under Chinese rule and the new Soviet Union. I'm going to play an example from a recording that's from just a few years later, but it'll give you a sense of the kind of music that people were foxtrotting to. Of swing, they're trying to get into it. It's very early jazz in this moment. And that brings me to my final chapter, which is Operatic Extraterritoriality, touring musicians in the Sino-Soviet War of 1929. So Stalin, right, comes to power, and he looks at the situation in the Far East, and he says, ooh, that was a former kind of colonial space, and it was actually quite profitable for us. We need to take back this railway. And so the Republic of China recognizes the Soviet Union in 1924, and as part of that recognition, they decide to jointly operate the railway. Well, what the Soviets do is they actually stack their representatives and people sympathetic to the Soviet cause. And what happens is that warlord gets super angry, and the geopolitical tensions rise quite quickly. There's a raid on the Soviet embassy in Beijing. People are being beheaded. It's really, really intense. But what do they decide to do amidst all of this political violence is they decide to send an opera out to this region. What a better way to show that the Soviets actually own the Eastern Railway by sending an opera called the Soviet Opera of the Chinese Eastern Railway and performing the fact that they have control over it. And so here's a bit from one of the memoirs of the visiting Soviet singers. I was convinced the very first morning of the blind hatred of everything Soviet. As soon as I managed to step outside the hotel, a taxi pulled up and the driver offered his services to me in perfect Russian. I sat in my car and my attention turned to the city, whose daily life differed drastically from ours in the USSR. The driver started up a conversation. He was 30 years old, wearing an unkempt, greasy coat and hat. Having heard that I was from Moscow, he asked, "Well, how is life there?" "Very good," I answered without a second thought. My words shot through him like bullets. His face changed and became angry as a wild boar. My taxi driver turned out to be a former officer. I felt the rage of the white emigres, fueled by the Russian nobility led by Prince Kirill. The encounter put me on guard. I understood how difficult it would be to work here and carefully tried to avoid similar incidents. This is very typical from the kinds of things published by these Soviet opera singers. In fact, we can think about this tour on one level as being a kind of propaganda campaign, right? They're trying to show how great it is, life in the Soviet Union. It's not so bad under Stalin after all. But when we start to read between the lines, we start to think, well, when was this memoir published? Oh, it's published during the Soviet period. And in fact, there are other letters and things that show that Lemeshev in particular had a great time in Harbin. He just wasn't able to publish and write his true thoughts about it. In fact, this propaganda campaign backfired. When we think about an opera and how it has to be staged, it's not just one person or a group of singers, right? You have to have props and sets and an orchestra. And where were they going to find these things? They had to collaborate with the locals, right? With the emigres and the Chinese workers who were supposedly their enemies. And what happens is that this concert hall here, the Railway Assembly Hall, in my argument, becomes a zone of informal extraterritoriality, one that is temporarily and tenuously removed from the conflict. These are people collaborating with one another on either side, right? And so what you have is a shift from propaganda to collaboration, from Soviet agents who were, sent out there as representatives of Stalin's government. Well, they're adopted by the local community. They're like, oh, you're just like us. You came across the border. You're singing music that we like. Actually, you're one of us. You're emigres on your own. And when they return, they launch their own Harbin war on the Moscow Opera. So it really does backfire. They get sent out for the purposes of propaganda, but when they leave, they've been adopted by the local community and are actually bringing these new emigre sensibilities back with them. And one of the cool things that happened in the middle of this tour is that Victor Records actually sent out recording scouts, for whatever reason, to the middle of Manchuria, where people are being beheaded and all of these violent political tensions are rising, and they decide to make some recordings. And so what we have are these really interesting artifacts from that specific period in May and June of 1928. And the museum here has those recordings. And one of the things that I've done is actually digitize them for the first time. So we'll take a bit longer listen to Lemeshev here on this recording.
Природа
just this record, you hear the collaboration of people on either side of this conflict. And this is not, you know, a story of showing how music is crossing all the great divides and solving all the problems. The war still happened, right? The war still happened, and the opera singers actually only left a few months before the shooting began. But it still remains an artifact of what can happen when people listen to one another, right? And choose to collaborate. That brings me to my research methodology. So how I did what I did. As Margarita already mentioned, I came here in 2018, and I decided to do a research project on the Russian area of San Francisco. This was part of my methods class, and so I did a mini ethnography. I was at different churches and interviewing different people. You can see me here standing. And I got to know the Russian community here really well, and have had the great opportunity to go and meet so many wonderful, wonderful people. And as Margarita mentioned, I came and I asked, you know, what of music do you have? And she said, oh, we have some records in the attic. And when I went up there, the more I dug, the more I found. And really, it's unfathomable how many records were up there. The collection now is over 3,000 recordings that I've gone through and had the chance to actually put together into this collection here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the things that I did was, during the pandemic, double down on the work that I've done here. And it's been really, really wonderful to have the support of the museum staff and to have a place where I could actually do research and you know, do the things that I needed to do for my dissertation amidst, you know, all of the upheaval that happened alongside COVID. And I've had the great fortune to collaborate with the staff and get a grant from the National Recording Preservation Foundation. And one of the things that we've done is digitize 200 of the rarest recordings, which are now up on the Internet Archive. I'd be happy to send you the link. And the other thing is put everything together nicely. So all of these things were uncatalogued, you know, sort of random. You had Frank Sinatra mixed in with these recordings from Harbin, mixed in with pre-revolutionary, mixed in with emigre recordings from Germany. And my lovely wife and I went through and tried to sort everything out. So thank you, Anya, for that, for helping me to come up with the system. And thank you to my mom for the idea of bungee cording to try and earthquake-proof the collection as best that we could. Here at the Museum Archive of Russian Culture, I've also had the great chance to look into a bunch of different publications. So I wasn't just working with recordings. A few of the emigre things that I've worked with are the magazine Rubège, Projector, and Phoenix, which are here in this archive, and really nowhere else in California can you find such a rich collection of these materials. Alongside letters, so here's a letter actually from Victor Talking Machine Company sent to one of the artists who made these recordings, and that allowed me to understand a bit more about how that actually worked, right? Who got payment, when these recordings were sent out, and how they were actually processed. But also a lot of concert programs, which has given me a ton of information on how the Russians and the Chinese, and later the Japanese subjects of the city lived alongside one another and collaborated with one another. And these things here at the museum I've supplemented with diving into you know, composers' letters, artists' letters, memoirs, and other materials. I've also had the great fortune of doing research outside of California, and so I'll give you a second to guess where I might be in these various locations. Okay, you ready for the first one on the left? So that's at the Rodgers and Hammerstein Collection of Recorded Sound in New York. Second one, that's in Amherst, Massachusetts. The third one, that's in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress. Osaka. Osaka, yes. That's at Osaka College of Music. Gold star to you. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Anyone recognize this building? Harbin, this is actually the Railway Assembly Hall where those opera singers actually were performing. And of course the Hoover Institution at Stanford and the Harry Ransom Center in Austin. Very quickly to go through a few of the publications that I've gone through. And when I say go through the publications, I mean opening up every single issue. So Театр и искусство, Theater and Art, this magazine was weekly, published weekly, and so I went through about 10 years of this publication. Le Petit Journal, Les Épices с Японии, different imperial publications, different imperial newspapers as well. These were both daily, so I've gone through several years of these, poring over just to try and find any mentions of the artists that I've been looking for. Also a couple gramophone magazines and illustrated journals and issues. And you can imagine this is like several years of just poring over these publications, alongside several of the newly digitized newspapers from the Hoover Institution. And these are emigre newspapers, as well as tons of Soviet publications. Okay, this brings us to our final little bit here, which is future research directions, now that I will be finishing up tomorrow and walking across the stage. The first is Russo-Japanese musical exchange, right? I talk about the Russo-Japanese War, but actually there were a lot of collaborations that happened between Russian and Japanese musicians, both during this period of extraterritoriality, but also onward during the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Inter-diasporic musical circulation. So there's one group of Russians in Harbin, but of course there are Russians in Paris and in New York and in Berlin. And this is a really famous recording called Harbin Papa, written by this person here, Vladimir Trachtenberg. And he wrote the lyrics, sent them to Berlin in 1935. They're both Jewish, by the way, in Berlin, under Hitler's rule. And they made this recording, which I will play just a short sample of. And I'm happy to say that I will be presenting this research at the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies annual convention with Filippo here in the audience in the fall. And one last thing is Fyodor Shalapin's 1936 tour to Harbin, probably the most famous Russian opera singer of all time. He actually made the trek all the way out to Harbin, and our archive here has a couple of recordings that he made both during this tour, but also recordings that he signed in his own penmanship in that extra space here in the archive. So instead of having you all ask me a million questions about all of my research, which I know you would love to do, you can do it in the after bit. I thought it would be more fun for me to ask you some questions and give you the chance to win one of 3 prestigious stickers. And so my first question is, who is this? And when did he come to Harbin?
The U.S. President?
You can raise your hand if you have any. It's Shalapin. And when did he come?
36.
36. So, you can have a sticker. Okay, I promise the others will be a bit easier. One of the recordings I talked about was On the Hills of Manchuria. Which conflict, which major world conflict, was this recording dedicated to?
The Russo-Japanese War.
Russo-Japanese War. That is correct. You passed the sticker back. Okay, and last but not least, what is the term used to describe the condition that Harbin existed in, the geopolitical situation? I saw Garrett.
Imperial imagination?
Almost.
Extraterritorial.
Extraterritoriality. So thank you so much for being here. I really, really would love to thank you all in person. So please come up to me after, and you know, I'd love to give you all a hug. Thanks especially to Anya Gourley, my wife, for so much of her help. Thank you to my dissertation committee, Nicholas Matthew, Maria Senovitsky, Maria Abe, and Edward Tyerman, as well as the staff here at the museum, Yves Frankian and Margarita Minyalika, for their tireless support, to all of the centers who have supported me here at Berkeley and elsewhere. And I would like to conclude with a gift to the museum. And this is for Yves and Margarita in their honor. Some of the earliest Russian recordings ever made. These are not simply, shellac recordings. These are wax cylinders, right? So the earliest form of sound recording. And you can see here on this canister, it has both San Francisco and St. Petersburg. So I thought that would be pretty cool. For Yves, this wax cylinder recording is the Russian national anthem and Belgian national anthem.
Предлагаю сказать что-то слушателям по поводу выступления. Что я хочу тебе сказать. Твоя работа, которую ты сделал, она много шире того, что ты рассказал. Не только шире, но и глубже немножечко. Ты рассказывал и описывал то, что происходило, и очень интересно увязал то, что как бы политическое развитие в Манчжурии вместе с ее музыкальным развитием. Одно, к сожалению, от другого не отделимо. Новая эпоха, как говорится, новое время, новые песни. И вот у тебя очень хорошо это получилось. Но есть еще один ответвление, которое у тебя есть. Ты в процессе своих исследований раскопал некоторую загадку, которая составила украшением моей книжки, которую я написал. Ты исследовал проблему песенки Бальчича и его составляющей части. Она необходима вещь не в Манчжурии, но тем не менее она принадлежит к той области, которую ты изучал, записи русских музыкантов, которые сохранились, музыкантов-иммигрантов. И вот там ты решил загадку, которая казалась неразрешимой. Ты ее сделал так элегантно, так легко и интересно, что это стало статьей твоей в издании Института истории искусства в Петербурге, и написано по-английски, а она в другой реинкарнации, да? Она превратилась в русскую главу в моей книжке, чего очень рад. Это служит украшением моего труда. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо,
что мы с тобой в каком-то смысле соавторы, хотя каждый написал свое, только со ссылкой на второе, без соавторства. Мне хотелось бы в будущем, понимаете, быть твоим соавтором в каком-то твоем достижении.
Я был бы рад. Спасибо огромное. Спасибо.
We have our guest, Georgy Schiller. He was born in Shanghai in 1929.
I'd like everyone to raise the toast for our next Ph.D. Ryan. And I hope everyone enjoyed the his presentation. It was very, very nice, educational. And you finally, I was wondering, when you're going to say something about famous singer Shadapin. You finally did at the end. Thank you. He was in Shanghai.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, enjoy.
From the Museum of Russian Culture, we are so happy that you all came to support him. So we like him very much. So as soon as you finish пирожки, then it will be a big cake, okay? Don't leave, okay?
Okay.